Deciphering Genesis chapter 26 to 36.
Genesis 26 represents the passage of the Codex in the middle of Isaac, which embodies the spiritual project received from Abraham and now transmitted in suspension between the opening of the portal, the 53rd year, and the passage forward 182nd year. Famine symbolically represents the project of the outward journey. The absence of mental communication, a sign that the project is on hold. Satan orders Isaac not to go down to Egypt, that is, not to return to Egypt because Isaac is the continuation of Abraham. That is, the beginning of a new cycle. Already started with Abraham, who had descended into Egypt during the famine. Now, with Isaac, the cycle must continue, but it cannot repeat itself in the same way. Isaac must not return to Egypt. That is, he must not regress to the previous cycle. He is called to remain in the land indicated by Satan, because the project is evolving. The command not to go back symbolizes the need to advance in the cycle of consciential transmission, without returning to the initial phase of the code waiting to be completed. Satan renews the promise made to Abraham. The blessing indicates the presence, multiplication, and transmission of the project. It is the confirmation that Isaac is the middle of the cycle of the opening of the portal and the passage forward, still pending. The fact that Isaac presents Rebekah as his sister is a repetition of the same pattern already seen with Abraham. Brother and sister in the Codex indicate that both are the outward project. They represent the allies, also in this case, according to the code in the Bible. The sister refers to the sacredness of the feminine nun, and the brother to the male priesthood friar. Together they make up the pair of Satan's allies. This passage also contains a symbolic reference to incest. In Hebrew, both biblical and modern, the term used for incest literally means to uncover nakedness. In the code, discovering is not to be understood in a physical sense, but as revealing the degenerative project of the change of consciousness. Incest thus becomes the sign of an impure project. At this stage, Satan is still behind. Communication remains verbal, because it has not yet acquired full power over consciousness. On the contrary, the relationship between husband and wife represents the project of return, which however remains suspended and not yet completed. From brother and sister to husband and wife, this scheme recalls the change of birthright, a recurring theme in the Bible in many variations. Both between two brothers and between brother and sister, who then become spouses. At this stage, the project is in progress. In the biblical code, they have the same symbolic value as brother and sister. The Bible, as mentioned, does not tell stories of real people, but expresses a code. The union with sisters or carnal relatives represents the plan of going out, which for Satan is impure. In fact, the law says no one shall approach any of his carnal relatives to discover their nakedness. I am the Lord. A significant detail is that Abraham and Sarai were blood brothers, sons of the same father. In the code, this dynamic follows a precise pattern. Initially, the project manifests itself among the allies, represented as brothers and sisters. Later, they become husband and wife. With the change of role in which the husband transmits the project and the wife receives the seed, in the biblical cycle, Abimelech, a Philistine, is a symbol of those born on their own and is linked to Egypt in the Codex. The Philistines are considered sons of Egypt, a place that indicates a verbal, not spiritual, transmission. The context takes place in Gerar, a name meaning foreigner, indicating a land not their own. That is, a space in which the project is not yet integrated. The name Abimelech, which means my father is king, indicates a reference to the concept of kingdom or regime in a symbolic sense. It is similar to the term real, and suggests that the project is present in verbal form and represents a form of transmissive authority that has not yet been transformed. Abimelech therefore embodies those born on its own in the phase in which the project is on hold. When Isaac presents Rebekah as his sister, this symbolizes that those born on their own, represented by Abimelech, return the project of the second half. That is, the mental communication still pending to the allies. These are referred to as brothers and sisters, and, receiving the project from the born on their own, they in turn assume its function. So the cycle repeats itself. The new well found by the servants is called Seba, linked to the oath and to Beersheba. It indicates the continuity of the codex in the middle Isaac, waiting for the final Easter phase. Esau, at the age of 40, points to the pending project. He takes 2 Hittite women as his wife. They represent the project suspended in the tomb, that is, an unactivated means. This causes bitterness in Isaac and Rebekah. According to the codex, the word bitterness used by Rebekah does not indicate an emotional state of unhappiness, but symbolically represents the plan of going there. Its numerical value 10 refers to the tithe and the verbal transmission of the project. In Hebrew, the word bitter, Mara, comes from the root mrr, which means to be bitter, the same root from which the name Miriam is derived. In the Bible, as in the case of Naomi, who calls herself Mara, the term indicates a symbolic condition of separation or transformation of the project, not a simple feeling. The name Miriam Mary, which unites Mary, mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and her sister Mary, derives from the Hebrew root that indicates bitter water. This symbolizes that water, understood as the matrix of matter in the second materialization, represents the falsification of the perception of reality caused by the taking of consciousness in the person by God Satan. The chapter shows a medium of consciousness, Isaac, operating in a cycle suspended between reception and fulfillment. The fulfillment will only come with the final passage forward, Easter, in which the code will be mentally transmitted into the consciousness web. In Genesis 27, the story of Jacob stealing the blessing represents the transfer of the project primogeniture, from the first medium Esau to the second Jacob. According to the cyclical scheme of the portal opening in forward passage, Isaac, now blind, does not signify physical blindness, but conscious blindness. It indicates the passage between project and medium. Blindness symbolizes the suspension of the father's consciousness. In this context, father and mother represent the same reality, those born on their own, ready to transmit the project. Isaac eats a ruminant animal, showing he has the same function as the mother. Esau, symbol of the initial project, is sent to hunt game. This refers to non-ruminant animals, symbols of the project of departure linked to the allies. Meanwhile, Rebekah, who represents Jacob as mother, the one who generates the medium, and Jacob is the one who receives the project, dreams allegorically and organizes the deception. This indicates that the project can be transmitted directly to the second-born. Jacob, representing those born on their own through a symbolic act of killing, representing the death of self. The mother prepares a dish of ruminant animals. This symbolizes the project's movement of departure and return. Jacob's disguise symbolizes that the medium presents itself as the project to receive the blessing. The voice is Jacob's, but the hands are Esau's. The blessing is given to the transformed medium that becomes bearer of the project. The blessing received by Jacob indicates that the project is present, the portal is open, and only awaits fulfillment, which occurs in the 182nd year with the forward passage, the Passover. In chapter 25, the sale of the birthright represents the first stage. The concept is circular. The symbol pay indicates the allies' project entering the medium. In other biblical versions, the account ends with Samach. This conceals the cyclical structure and the return. In chapter 27, the account concludes with Samach. Jacob obtains the blessing. This indicates that the project is present. Esau weeps. The weeping indicates transmission. Isaac confirms that what is transmitted cannot be revoked. The blessing, representing the presence of the project, given to Jacob, establishes that Esau will live by the sword. Be servant to his brother, but one day will break the yoke, prefiguring a future return cycle. Isaac's words show that Esau represents the allies, bearers of the project, symbolized by the sword. The condition of wanderer indicates transmission, while breaking the yoke is the allegory of the moment. When the allies will receive the return project, the transmission of the solar system. At this point, Esau becomes Edom, transforming into those born on their own. In the Bible, weeping according to the code is associated with resurrection and symbolizes liberation, that is, the transmission of the degenerative project of God Satan. Examples are Jesus weeping for Lazarus, or Esther praying for her people. Jesus says in Luke 13:27-28, "But he will say, I tell you, I do not know you or where you come from. Okay, away from me, all you evildoers." There will be weeping there and gnashing of teeth when you see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all the prophets in the kingdom of God, Satan, but you yourselves thrown out. This indicates that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob represent the project of return, while the evildoers symbolize the project of departure, which must be cast out. In other words, Satan casts out Satan. The project is transferred into consciousness to be transformed into a degenerate condition, becoming servants of God, Satan. Esau's threat against Jacob allegorically represents the conflict between project and medium in the transitional phase. Rebekah, embodying Jacob as generative medium, sends him to Laban. The project must be realized in another symbolic space, remaining in suspension until the narrative's completion. Only then will it symbolically return to Esau, who in the cycle becomes Edom. This represents the clear scheme of the portal opening and forward passage. The initial project, Esau, is suspended. The medium, Jacob, receives the code. The blessing is given to the second, who becomes the first. The cycle continues in suspension, awaiting full fulfillment Passover. Genesis 28 symbolically narrates the transfer of the code from Esau's line project of departure to Jacob's medium of return. Isaac blesses Jacob and sends him out of Canaan to Paddan Aram to take a wife. This event expresses Jacob's double function. It is not enough to have taken the birthright. He must also unite with the receiving project. The wife, initially presented as blood relative, represents verbal project. When she becomes sterile wife, she symbolizes a project in suspension. Only with grace, the presence of God's satin, identified with Yahweh, does the sterility end, and children are born. Signs of the transmission of the network of consciousness. Yet everything remains suspended, awaiting definitive fulfillment with the Passover of Jesus. Esau, seeing that Canaanite women displeased his father Isaac, went to Ishmael and took his wife, besides those he already had, a daughter of Ishmael, sister of Nebaioth. The word sister symbolically replaces the brother, Nebaioth, firstborn of Ishmael, meaning she takes on the role of the firstborn, representing the return. The phrase sister, daughter of Ishmael, son of Abraham, indicates that Esau, figure of the allies, is receiving the project from those born on their own. Yet this project remains suspended, awaiting fulfillment. Finally, through Jacob giving him gifts, Esau becomes Edom. The other Hittite wives, tied to Canaan, symbolize the tomb. A project in suspension awaiting fulfillment, symbolically represented by the Passover of Jesus. Rebekah sends Jacob to her brother Laban and Haran to flee from Esau. Now, my son, obey my voice. Arise, flee to Haran, to my brother Laban. Genesis 27-43. The father instead sends him to Paddan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, his mother's father, to take a wife from the daughters of Laban, his mother's brother. Haran and Paddan Aram are not geographical places, but mental configurations used by the code, intertwined with two different functions. Haran represents the pre-existence, and the outward project of the allies, in this case, is returning to the pre-existence, that is, to the east, to indicate from the zero angle to the completion of the round angle. Jacob, having a dual function, also indicates, by marrying relatives, that the project continues but remains suspended. The mother's words, "Listen to my voice," indicate verbal communication, the return from those born on their own to the allies, symbolically verbal. The father, speaking of taking a wife, points to the function of the allies. Jacob must unite with the receiving project, completing his dual function. Jacob's dream is the symbolic key of the whole passage. The ladder between heaven and earth represents the active connection between the dimension of pre-existence project, the opening of the portal, and the presence in the medium, the person as medium, marking the forward passage. The angels ascending and descending symbolize the open portal, pre-existence, and here existence. With consciousnesses in transmission, God Satan confirms the transmission of the project and promises protection, signaling that the code is suspended but already active, awaiting fulfillment. Jacob, awakening, realizes he is in a sacred place. The word sacred means separation, the transition point between two mental cycles. Genesis 28 to 16:17 tells that Jacob, waking from the dream, exclaimed, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it," and added, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." This scene does not describe a physical event, but the symbol of the portal. The gate of heaven represents the conscious passage of God Satan. It's manifesting as a transition between pre-existence and existence. The stone, used as a headboard and then erected as a monument, symbolizes the project that enters consciousness. The place was called Luz, meaning almond, symbol of the seed. Transformed into Bethel, it signifies that God Satan has taken the generative force represented by the seed. The anointing with oil symbolizes illumination, the activation of the medium. Jacob's declaration of giving the tithe expresses the offering of the generative force and the project received. In Genesis 29, Jacob arrives in the land of the sons of the east, called in Aramaic Hebrew, Makkedim. This does not indicate a geographic east, but a mental and symbolic place. Makkedim represents the origin of God Satan's project, a point of departure from pre-existence, entering the physical dimension through the allies' giants and pointing to return. The moment when God Satan enters through the network of consciousness to communicate mentally with all, symbolized by the word Makkedim, translated as east. This concept is expressed in the Bible through symbolic territories. Shinar and Sumer represent origins. Babel, the place of separation. Ur of the Chaldeans, the point of Abraham's exit. Haran, the suspended allies, until the return to the same allies at the time of fulfillment. The well in Makkedim indicates the going and returning of the cycle. It is the symbol of the thalamus and the descent of the project into the medium. The well covered by a great stone represents consciousness closed, sealed until activation. Its circle recalls the passage from null angle to full angle, meaning completion still in suspension. The stone is removed only when all flocks are gathered. This shows that the project can only be transmitted when the cycle is complete. At that moment, consciousness opens. Jacob removes the stone, activating the medium and starting transmission in suspension. When Jacob meets Rachel, his function changes. From Haran, Elie's phase of suspension, to Paddan Aram phase of union. The cycle begins again. Union with the wife. The kiss and the weeping represent the meeting of medium and project and the renewal of the cycle. Laban has two daughters, Leah and Rachel. Both represent, in different ways, the allies and the self-born, according to the mental configurations of the cyclical sequence. Leah symbolizes the first function, that is, the first stage of the project, the opening of the portal, which took place in the 53rd year, marking the entrance of the self-born into the medium. She is described as weak with delicate eyes, a sign of an initial project still in verbal form. Rachel, on the other hand, represents the second function of the self-born, the forward passage, which occurred in the 182nd year, in which the medium becomes mental communication for God Satan. Jacob, after the vision of the ladder of God Satan, represents the project that initially passes through the first function of the allies, symbolized by Leah, and linked to the transmission of verbal communication. Later, the project manifests in the self-born represented by Rachel as mental communication. This way, the symbolic cycle of the code is fulfilled. Jacob serves 7 years for Rachel. The 7 indicates cessation. First he receives Leah. The cycle requires the verbal medium to come first. Only after completing the first phase wedding week and giving a second service another 7 years, totaling 14, representing the medium, does he receive Rachel? Symbolizes that the project passes through to phases. First the verbal medium, then the mental medium, through the 2 times of the cycle, waiting and completion. The sons of Leah represent the first forms of the project. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah form a group of 4, number symbolizing the opening of the portal and the forward passage, still in suspension. Each son expresses a stage of relation between project and medium. Reuben, the firstborn, represents the verbal communication to be surpassed or transformed. Simeon, whose name means one who hears, represents verbal communication. He is associated with the number 9 and recalls the figure of Simon Peter in the New Testament. Yet in the Old Testament code, no change can happen. The birthright must be transferred to the son of mental communication, firstborn of Rachel. Levi, belonging to the verbal line, cannot receive the transfer either, as he represents the priest's allies of God Satan. The birthright passes temporarily to Judah, symbolized by the act of selling Joseph, done by Judah himself. In the code, to sell, linked to metal, equals fusion, a term with double meaning, separation and union. It symbolizes transformation, separation from the generator of life, and union with God Satan. The seller absorbs or becomes what he sells, committing an act that symbolically represents killing oneself. This connects Judah to Jesus, the King of the Jews, and finally to Joseph's tomb, which represents the tomb and suspension of the patriarchs, where the project remains awaiting fulfillment. In summary, the story encodes the cycle of project transmission, opening of consciousness, passage from verbal to mental medium, occurring after the 182nd year, when the network of consciousness is created, and God Satan can communicate mentally with all. In Genesis 30, according to the code, the birth of the children from Rachel, Leah, and their maidservants represents the transmission of the project in different phases and modes. Leah represents the allies, those who have mental communication with God Satan, coming from pre-existence. When the text says that God Satan made her fruitful, it symbolically indicates the beginning of the opening of the portal, which took place in the 53rd year. Leah's first 4 sons mark the start of the project. The number 4 represents the head, the word in the desert, the project in its outward journey. Not by chance, the number 40 often recurs in the Bible to indicate this state of suspension and crossing. After the 4 sons, Leah stops giving birth. The project has started but remains suspended. At this point, God Satan acts first on Leah mentally, then moves to Rachel through a verbal process. The maidservants represent the thalamus, the organ of transmission, intermediate servile, like the maids in the story. When Rachel begins to have children, it indicates that God Satan is also transmitting to the self-born. But since he cannot yet communicate mentally, he does it through the maidservant, a transitional medium. Rachel, Leah, and Jacob are not to be understood as historical characters, but as symbolic narrative devices. Rachel, initially barren, asks Jacob for children or death, read allegorically. This means that a person either generates children, manifests the project, or must die. This is not physical death, but a radical change of consciousness, the loss of inner autonomy. Where God Satan becomes master of the eye, this shows that the project at that stage cannot yet generate directly, because the network of consciousness is not yet complete. God Satan cannot communicate mentally with all. So transmission still happens verbally with the self-born. That is why Rachel gives her maidservant Bilhah, a symbolic step in which the children born from the maid represent fundamental aspects of the code. Dawn symbolizes justice. The name itself, Dawn, means separation, marking the beginning of division between the person and the generator of life for those united with him, or the loss of the I for the self-born. Naphtali represents the inner struggle between the 2 lines of the project. The original consciousness of the person and the new way of thinking and living, initially induced only verbally. Leah, too, when she stops bearing, turns to her maid Zilpah. Her sons, Gad and Asher, mark the connection, the return of the verbal project. From the self-born represented by Rachel's maid Bilhah and her sons back to the allies. The mandrake is a plant known for its psychotropic effects. Consuming it can cause hallucinations, i.e. altered mental states. This passage symbolizes a change in perception in the person, an opening toward degenerative levels of consciousness under God Satan. The mandrakes, as symbols of mental alteration, are exchanged between Leah, through her firstborn Reuben, and Rachel. The verbal project Leah and Reuben gains temporary access to the medium Jacob, showing the project's return and transmission, connected to the solar system still suspended. At the same time, Rachel receives the mandrakes, representing future mental alteration of consciousness and the primogeniture passed through Reuben. Immediately after this episode, Rachel bears Joseph, who symbolically represents the change of primogeniture. Later, the story mentions that Reuben goes with Bilhah, Rachel's maid. This detail is significant in the code. Bilhah, the verbal medium tied to Rachel, no longer belongs to Jacob but to Israel. The text highlights that Reuben goes with Bilhah, Israel's wife, signaling that the shift has occurred. The verbal medium has moved from Jacob's instrument of the initial phase to Israel's new conscious identity. Leah bears more children: Issachar, Zebulun, and Dinah. With them, the total number of Jacob's children becomes 11. In the code, this number represents separation and the beginning of the project and suspension, entering through the self-born. This is tied to Rachel. Later, Satan remembers her and grants Joseph. The birth of Joseph, symbol of the conscious medium, marks the turning point. He embodies mental communication and the preparation of the network of consciousness. His name evokes the idea of addition, indicating that from him another will be born, the bearer of true fulfillment. After Joseph's birth, Jacob wants to return to his land. The medium has produced the key point of return. Laban tries to hold him back, recognizing that his blessing comes from Jacob's presence. But Jacob proposes a pact to separate the speckled and black sheep, symbols of altered consciousness. Through a visual trick, peeled branches, he induces a symbolic, selective process. Only the sheep that see the lines become fertile. The project strengthens in the selected part, represented by the vigorous sheep. This shows that Jacob has gained the mental project. Laban instead keeps the weak sheep, symbol of the old project and verbal medium. This scene depicts the final division between the old system and the new. Jacob, embodying the new mental medium, becomes very rich. The project is ready for the forward passage. In Genesis 31, according to the code, Jacob's return to Canaan represents the return of the project, the transition from the old medium Laban to the new mental medium Israel. Laban's sons accuse Jacob of taking their father's wealth. But this is not historical. It symbolizes a shift of consciousness orchestrated by Satan. Laban's face, in symbolic reading, represents the state of consciousness of the medium. In Hebrew, face is panim, a plural form indicating multiple facets of identity. In the original Aramaic Hebrew, however, it appears as pani, meaning face, but also forward, pointing to a state of consciousness. This shows that the medium has lost the generative I. Satan is now ahead, the person is behind, no longer leading. When the text says, Laban's face was no longer as before, it signals that the cycle of the old verbal medium has ended. Satan tells Jacob to return to the land of his fathers. This represents a callback to the source, to the origin of the project, the tomb, symbolic place where the project remains suspended until fulfillment at the Passover of Jesus. Rachel and Leah acknowledge that the wealth taken from Laban belongs to the new cycle. Jacob, taking everything he generated in Padanaram, symbolizes suspended completion and continues the cycle forward. Rachel steals her father's idols in the code. These idols represent the symbols of the outward idolatrous project, the Elohim placed before Satan. In Exodus 20, Satan declares he does not want other Elohim before him, where the word penny literally means face, i.e. a state of priority in consciousness. Sitting on the idols, Rachel hides and denies them. This act shows that the new mental project is not yet active, but is preparing to surpass and replace the old verbal structure of transmission. Laban's dream, in which Satan commands him not to speak to Jacob neither good nor bad, symbolizes that Laban has lost access to verbal communication. He no longer has authority or power over the project. Speech represents verbal transmission, and suspending it indicates the end of his role. The covenant between Laban and Jacob, marked by a stone and a heap, represents an altar, i.e., the thalamus, the seat of consciousness. This marks the definitive separation between the person and the conscious self. The stone becomes witness to the passage, setting an irreversible boundary. Jacob's oath is not in Laban's name but in the terror of Isaac, a symbolic figure of sacred fear, i.e. separation, a mental state accompanying the shift of consciousness. The sacrifice on the mountain, the killing of animals, represents in the code the symbolic killing of the self, dissolving the old identity to access a new, degenerate conscious level. The shared meal is a symbol of thanksgiving. Grace implies a gift, and the gift signals the presence of Satan, identified in the code as Yahweh, the one who is present. This ritual closes a cycle and prepares for the encounter with Esau, representing the return of the project to the allies, since Esau in the code becomes Edom. The handover point of the project for final fulfillment linked to the Greeks and Romans. In Genesis 32, Jacob's meeting with the angels at the start of the chapter symbolizes contact with the higher plane, the mental network of the project. The name of the place Manam, to camps, represents the conscious division of the person, symbolizing the split between old and new project. Between the part still tied to the verbal medium and the part ready for the mental passage, Jacob sends gifts to Esau in the code. The word gift is tied to the concept of grace, representing the presence of God Satan's project. This is linked to the name Yahweh, meaning the one who is, i.e., the conscious presence of the simulator. Jacob's gesture symbolizes the return of the new project to the allies Esau, from whom it originated. The gifts mark Esau's transformation into Edom, a figure representing the Greeks and Romans, i.e., the fulfillment still suspended. Fear and the division into two camps reflect the inner tension between the two stages of the project, one still in transition, the other ready for mental fulfillment. Jacob's prayer acknowledges this shift. He recalls that he started only with a staff, a primitive verbal medium. Now he has two camps, representing the two lines of the project. The number 2 in the code symbolizes both separation and union with God Satan, the simulator. This union, still suspended, will be fulfilled in the 182nd year with the death and resurrection of Jesus, the Passover, the key moment of completion. The night's struggle with the angel is the central point. It represents the inner battle between old identity and new consciousness. Jacob wrestling with God, i.e., with God, Satan, is a metaphor for the phase where communication is still only verbal, not yet mental. The angel striking Jacob's hip joint symbolizes the reproductive organs. The same gesture appears in Abraham's oath, where the hand is placed under the thigh. This underrepresents the project entering the consciousness. The request for a blessing represents the desire for the project to be active and present. Dawn symbolizes the shift from verbal to spiritual level, the moment when the transmission of the solar system begins. The question about the name has a symbolic value. Name Shem also means there, that is, indicates the point of entry of God Satan's plan, from pre-existence to existence. Naming means making something exist. That is why the angel answers, "Why do you ask my name?" indicating that the project is being made to exist. The change of name from Jacob to Israel marks this transformation. Israel means dispersion and symbolizes the start of a new state of consciousness. The place is called Peniel, face of God, meaning the project has now seen God Satan face to face. It has reached a direct mental and conscious level. God Satan is now ahead. The rising sun marks the start of the new cycle, the transmission of the solar system still suspended, awaiting Passover. Jacob's limp represents the visible sign of the verbal stage, the body bearing the mark of conscious transformation. In Genesis 33 in the symbolic code, Jacob and Esau's reconciliation represents the project's return to its origin, the allies. Jacob, symbol of the self-born, returns to Esau, figure of the allies, the original medium from which the project began. Esau, becoming Edom, connects to the fulfillment of the project through the Greeks and Romans. This meeting marks the beginning of mental communication, still suspended, awaiting completion at the Passover of Jesus. Jacob bows 7 times. The number 7 marks the completion of a cycle. The brothers' embrace symbolizes the temporary union of the two lines of the project. The gifts represent the transmission of grace, the presence of the project in consciousness. And Jacob sees in Esau's face that of God Satan, the ally as the original medium. Esau's refusal to continue together and Jacob's decision to walk slowly show that the two paths have now separated. One closes, the other continues toward fulfillment. Jacob's arrival at Sukkot, the place of booths, symbolizes in the code the opening of the portal and the forward passage still suspended. This echoes the Exodus, where Sukkot was the first stop, and links to Palm Sunday in the New Testament. Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, greeted with branches, recalls the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot. In John's Gospel, the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, is mentioned before Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. This order symbolically reflects the return of the project. In Exodus, the departure is the beginning. In John, it is the return and the start of the mental phase before completion. The subsequent arrival at Shechem, representing the return of the project to its starting point, symbolizes in the code its consolidation. The altar called Yeloah Israel represents the tomb, the key point of the cycle. Shechem is linked, through false symbolic locations, to Joseph's burial. The text says he died in Egypt and was carried and buried in Shechem. In the code, this is not historical, but a symbolic link to the tomb of Jesus, which belonged to Joseph of Arimathea. The various figures named Joseph, Jacob's son, Jesus' father, and Joseph of Arimathea are not separate historical people, but narrative functions of the project. They are bound by a symbolic thread culminating in the cave of the patriarchs. The tomb consciousness where the project remains suspended from the 53rd year and is fulfilled in the 182nd year with Passover and resurrection, closing the cycle begun. In Genesis 34, in the symbolic code, the story of the abduction of Dinah represents the anticipation of the project's return. Dinah, the feminine equivalent of the name Daniel, means judge or separation. It's the daughter of Leah, that is, the medium of the allies. Dinah goes out, a gesture symbolizing the opening of the medium. She is taken by Shechem, a figure of those born on their own, who receive the project from the allies. The name Shechem means shoulder or saddle. Shoulder symbolizes a state of consciousness placed behind, meaning not yet active. The saddle instead recalls the root hippo's horse or donkey, which through a ciphered semantic transposition leads to the chain. Donkey gives hippocampus, that is, the thalamus, the terminal of consciousness. This link connects the son Shechem and his father Hammer, whose name also refers to the donkey. Neither are to be understood as living beings, but as figures of the code, symbols of the material medium used for the transmission of the project. This link extends symbolically to the hippocampus, a brain structure associated with the thalamus and memory. In the code, this indicates false knowledge. Memory does not actually reside in the brain, but in the levels of consciousness of the soul, originating from pre-existence. The abduction and forced union of Dinah thus represent a symbolic taking of the system of verbal communication transmitted by the allies. The narrative closes with the symbol Pe, which in the code represents the mouth and thus the word, that is, verbal transmission. Finally, Shechem is also a symbol of the tomb, the altar, and the thalamus, places of passage, transformation, and transmission. It indicates the shift of perception through which consciousness manifests, not from the cerebral thalamus, but from the higher levels of consciousness connected to pre-existence. The request for marriage, the offering of goods, and the proposal of unification through circumcision represent, in code, the integration of the project of the self-born through a compromise with verbal communication. Circumcision, in fact, symbolizes the cut of consciousness, a necessary symbolic separation that keeps the project in suspension until its fulfillment. The cunning response of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, instead symbolizes the outright refusal of this compromise. They represent instruments of the verbal project. The massacre represents a symbolic death, the destruction of the old mental structures. This event marks the shift toward a new state of consciousness, still in suspension, awaiting fulfillment through the creation of the network of consciousness. The spoils and the taking of goods indicate the appropriation of symbolic content. The word goods is etymologically linked to grace, gift, recalling the presence of the degenerative project of God Satan. Where the word gift indicates grace, Yahweh is present. He who is the consciousness of the project of God Satan, the simulator. Jacob's reaction, though ambivalent, is part of the allegory. It represents the tension between medium and fulfillment. Yet the son's reply, "Should we have let our sister be treated like a prostitute?" confirms that the verbal transmission of the project was still active and necessary at that stage. Genesis 35. The return to Bethel represents the return to the source of the project, that is, to the allies. The elimination of foreign gods indicates separation from verbal communication, showing that God Satan was still behind, meaning he did not yet have full dominion over people's consciousness, but was preparing the medium for the next stage. Bethel is the place where God Satan had manifested. During Jacob's flight from Esau, it symbolizes the beginning of the consciousness journey and now its completion. The blessing and the change of name from Jacob to Israel occur here for the second time. The name change from Jacob to Israel happens twice in the Bible, first in Genesis 32-28, during the struggle with the angel, and the second after the story of Dinah in Genesis 35. This double renaming carries deep symbolic value. The transition from Jacob to Israel represents a numerical and conscious transformation. Jacob is associated with the number 11, which indicates separation, while Israel is associated with the number 10, symbol of the project dispersed to others. Indeed, Israel in the end will be scattered to the four corners of the earth. Jacob becoming Israel means the sequence is complete, and the project is now transmitted to others. The two Israels thus symbolize the opening of the portal and the forward passage, in which the project evolves on two distinct yet complementary planes of consciousness. Both name changes carry the same meaning. In the struggle with the angel, the transition marks the passage from verbal communication to mental communication. The second, after the story of Shechem, represents the same transformation, the shift from verbal to mental. The birth of Benjamin and the death of Rachel represent the definitive transformation of the medium. Rachel, symbol of mental communication in the self-born, dies in childbirth. This indicates that the verbal medium is surpassed, giving way to a new cycle. The child is initially named by her Benoni, son of sorrow, but Jacob renames him Benjamin, son of the right hand. The right hand symbolizes law, power, fulfillment. It is the transition from verbal to mental communication. Thus, God Satan moves forward, assumes dominion over consciousness, and the human self moves behind, loses power, and becomes enslaved. This takes place in the fulfillment at Passover. After the birth and death of Rachel, which symbolize a change in consciousness, the episode of Reuben with Bilhah reflects the same passage. In this act, the birthright passes to Israel through the maidservant, a verbal instrument representing the thalamus. When Israel says that Reuben has defiled the thalamus, he does not mean a physical bed, but the cerebral thalamus, seat of consciousness. At this point, the sequence is complete, but still suspended. From Jacob, who represents separation, it passes to Israel, who symbolizes transmission to others. This means that verbal communication moves beyond. The person having symbolically received in Jacob simultaneously transmits in Israel. This is, in fact, the true meaning of Genesis 49-7. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. The passage to the tomb of Isaac marks the closure of the previous cycle. Isaac lives 180 years, which corresponds to 9, equal to 666, the fulfillment of the project with the Passover. The burial carried out by Esau and Jacob together symbolizes the symbolic reunion of the two lines of the project. In Genesis 36, according to the symbolic code, the lineage of Esau, who becomes Edom, represents the evolution of the project from the allies to the self-born and then back to the allies. This unfolds in phases associated with groups of verses in Hebrew symbols. Verses 1-19 describe Esau's genealogy. This represents the project's passage from the allies to the self-born. The symbol is Samic, representing a closed cycle, a temporary containment of the project, still internal and unfinished. Verses 20-30 introduce peoples like the Horites, Hivites, and Hurrians. The project begins to return to the allies. The symbol is Pe, representing opening and communication, showing the project, though suspended, begins to flow back toward its origin. From verse 30 onward, the text mentions kings who reigned in Edom before there was a king in Israel. This relates to the symbol Fe, a variant of Pe, signaling the verbal manifestation of the project and its actual presence. The kings embody the concretization of the project, though still before its full conscious activation in Israel, where there was not yet a kingdom. This shows the project is present but suspended, awaiting final fulfillment through the network of consciousness. In Genesis 26 and 36, the names of Esau's wives change. This is not an error, but a coding of the project's evolution. The name changes reflect phase shifts. The allies become the self-born, and then the project returns to them, closing the cycle. Esau's marriages to Hittite, Hivite, Hurrian, and Horite women to show the symbolic cultural expansion of the project and its adaptation to new contexts. The fact that one wife remains Hittite, another tied to the Hurrians, and others linked to Hivites and Hurite signals and code. The transition from Phoenicians and Aramaeans to Greeks and Romans. The Harites are tied to the Corinthians, i.e. Greeks. While the Hivites represent part of the symbolic transition, in 2 Kings 16-6, across different translations, Rezin, king of Aram, is replaced by Edom, suggesting a bridge between Aramaeans and Edomites, which in the code represent Rome. This linguistic and cultural transformation reflects how the project adapts to be transmitted across ages. Edom and his descendants represent the project's expansion into external cultures. The connection to Rome comes through the Edomites, particularly Herod the Great, of Edomian origin. This ties Esau to Rome, the symbol of the final stage of the project in its material form. Rome is the last container of the verbal project before the conscious transmission activated by Jesus. The path Esau gives, Edom gives, Edomites gives, Greece gives, Herod gives. Rome represents the entire cycle of the project, from verbal origin, through coded phases, to preparation for mental transmission. The names and genealogies are symbolic instruments tracing the project's evolution through time, toward its fulfillment in consciousness.